Elie Wiesel's Night, Part 4.1. A half hour before the usual time to stop work, the capo assembled the entire commando. Roll call. Nobody understood what was going on. A roll call at this hour here? Only I knew. The capo made a short speech. An ordinary inmate does not have the right to mix into other people's affairs. One of you does not seem to have understood this point. I shall therefore try to make him understand clearly once and for all. I felt the sweat running down my back. A7713. I stepped forward. A crate, he ordered. They brought a crate. Great. Lie down on it, on your belly. I obeyed. I no longer felt anything except the lashes of the whip. 1, 2, he was counting. He took this time between lashes. He took his time between lashes. Only the first really hurt. I heard him count. 10, 11. His voice was calm and reached us through a thick wall. 23. 2 more. I thought, half unconscious. The capo was waiting. 24, 25. It was over. I had not realized it, but I had fainted. I came to conscious when they doused me with cold water. I was still lying on the crate. In a blur, I could see the wet ground next to me. Then I heard someone yell. It had to be the capo. I began to distinguish what he was shouting. Stand up. I must have made some movement to get up, but I felt myself fall back on the crate. How I wanted to get up. Stand up, he was yelling even more loudly. If only I could answer him, if only I could tell him that I could not move, but my mouth would not open. At Idik's command, 2 inmates lifted me and led me to him. Look me in the eye. I looked at him without seeing him. I was thinking of my father. He would be suffering more than I. Listen to me, you son of a swine, said Idik coldly. So much for your curiosity. You shall receive 5 times more if you dare tell anyone what you saw. Understood? I nodded once, 10 times, endlessly, as if my head had decided to say yes for all eternity. One Sunday, as half of our group, including my father, was at work, the others, including me, took the opportunity to stay and rest. At around 10 o'clock, the sirens started to go off alert. The blockletiste gathered us inside the blocks while the SS took refuge in the shelters. As it was relatively easy to escape during an alert, the guards left the watchtowers and the electric current in the barbed wire was cut. The standing order to the SS was to shoot anyone found outside his block. In no time, the camp had the look of an abandoned ship. No living soul in the alleys. Next to the kitchen, 2 cauldrons of hot, steaming soup had been left untended. 2 cauldrons of soup, smack in the middle of the road, 2 cauldrons of soup with no one to guard them. A royal feast going to waste. Supreme temptation, hundreds of eyes were looking at them, shining with desire. 2 lambs with hundreds of wolves lying in wait for them. 2 lambs without a shepherd, free for the taking. But who would dare? Fear was greater than hunger. Suddenly we saw the door of block 37 open slightly. A man appeared, crawling snake-like in the direction of the cauldrons. Hundreds of eyes were watching his every move. Hundreds of men were crawling with him, scraping their bodies with his on the stones. All hearts trembled, but mostly with envy. He was the one who had dared. He reached the first cauldron. Hearts were pounding harder. He had succeeded. Jealousy devoured us, consumed us. We never thought to admire him. Poor hero committing suicide for a ration of 2 or more of soup. In our minds, he was already dead. Lying on the ground near the cauldron, he was trying to lift himself to the cauldron's rim. Either out of weakness or out of fear, he remained there, undoubtedly to muster his strength. At last, he succeeded in pulling himself up to the rim. For a second, he seemed to be looking at himself in the soup, looking for his ghostly reflection there. Then, for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death rattle such as I had never heard before, and, with open mouth, thrust his head toward the still steaming liquid. We jumped at the sound of the shot, falling to the ground, his face stained with the soup. The man writhed a few seconds at the base of the cauldron, and then he was still. That was when we hear the planes. Almost at the same moment, the barrack began to shake. "They are bombing the Buna factory," someone shouted. I anxiously thought of my father who was at work, but I was glad nevertheless. To watch that factory go up in flames, what a revenge! While we had heard some talk of German military defeats on the various fronts, we were not sure if they were credible, but today this was real. We were not afraid, and yet if a bomb had fallen on the blocks, it would have claimed hundreds of inmates' lives. But we no longer feared death. In any event, not this particular death. Every bomb that hit filled us with joy, gave us renewed confidence. The raid lasted more than 1 hour. If only it could have gone on for 10 times 10 hours. Then once more there was silence. The last sound of the American plane dissipated in the wind, and there we were, in our cemetery. On the horizon we saw a long trail of black smoke. The sirens began to wail again, the end of the alert. Everyone came out of the blocks. We breathed in air filled with fire and smoke, and our eyes shone with hope. A bomb had landed in the middle of the camp near the Epiliplats, the assembly point, but had not exploded. We had to dispose of it outside the camp. The head of the camp, the Legerleste, accompanied by his aide and by the chief capo, were on an inspection tour of the camp. The raid had left traces of great fear on his face. In the very center of the camp lay the body of the man with soup stains on his face, the only victim. The cauldrons were carried back to the kitchen. The SS were back at their post in the watchtowers behind their machine guns. Intermission was over. An hour later, we saw the commandos returning. In steps as always, happily, I caught sight of my father. "Several buildings were flattered," he said, "but the depot was not touched." In the afternoon, we cheerfully went to clear the ruins. 1 week later, as we returned from work, there in the middle of the camp in the Epiliplats stood a black gallows. We learned that soup would be distributed only after roll call, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more harshly than on other days, and there were strange vibrations in the air. "Caps off!" The Legerleste suddenly shouted. 10,000 caps came off at once. "Cover your heads." 10,000 caps were back on our heads at lightning speed. The camp gate opened. An SS unit appeared and encircled us. One SS every 3 paces. The machine guns on the watchtowers were pointed toward the Epiliplats. "They're expecting trouble," whispered Julik. 2 SS were headed toward the solitary confinement cell. They came back, the condemned man between them. He was a young boy from Warsaw, an inmate with 3 years in concentration camps behind him. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. His back was to the gallows, his face turned towards his judge, the head of the camp. He was pale but seemed more solemn than frightened. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes were coolly assessing the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners surrounding him. The Legerleste began to read the verdict, emphasizing every word. "In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number stole during the air raid. According to the law, prisoner number is condemned to death. Let this be a warning and an example to all prisoners." Nobody moved. I heard the pounding of my heart. The thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau in the crematoria no longer troubled me. But this boy, leaning against his gallows, upset me deeply. "This ceremony, will it be over soon? I am hungry," whispered Julik. At a sign of the Legerleste, the Leger Capo stepped up to the condemned youth. He was assisted by 2 prisoners in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. The capo wanted to blindfold the youth, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, the hangman put the rope around his neck. He was about to signal his aides to pull the chair from under the young man's feet when the latter shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live liberty! My curse on Germany! My curse! My..." The executioner had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. "Caps off!" 10,000 prisoners paid their respects. Cover your heads. Then the entire camp, block after block, filed past the hanged boy and stared at his extinguished eyes, the tongue hanging from his gaping mouth. The capos forced everyone to look him squarely in the face. Afterward, we were given permission to go back to our block and have a meal. I remember that on that evening the soup tasted better than ever. I watched other hangings. I never saw a single victim weep. These withered bodies had long forgotten the bitter taste of tears, except one. The Oberkapo of the 52nd Cable Commando was a Dutchman, a giant of a man, well over 6 feet. He had some 700 prisoners under his command, and they all loved him like a brother. Nobody had ever endured a blow or even an insult from him. In his service was a young boy, a people, as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the people were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread." Understood? But the Dutchman's little servant was beloved by all. His was the face of an angel in distress. One day the power failed at the central electric plant in Buna. The Gestapo, summoned to inspect the damage, concluded that it was sabotage. They found a trail. It led to the block of the Dutch Oberkapo, and after a search they found a significant quantity of weapons. The Oberkapo was arrested on the spot. He was tortured for weeks on end in vain. He gave no names. He was transferred to Auschwitz and never heard from again. But his young people remained behind in solitary confinement. He too was tortured, but he too remained silent. The SS then condemned him to death, him and 2 other inmates who had been found to possess arms. One day, as we returned from work, we saw 3 gallows, 3 black ravens, erected on the Ebelplatz. Roll call. The SS surrounding us, machine guns aimed at us, the usual ritual. 3 prisoners in chains, and among them the little people, the sedate angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. This time, the Lagerkapo refused to act as executioner. 3 SS took his place. The 3 condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs in unison. The nooses were placed around their necks. "Long live liberty," shouted the 2 men. But the boy was silent. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the 3 chairs were tripped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Caps off," screamed the Lagerlaste. His voice is quivered. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. "Cover your heads." Then came the march past the victims. The 2 men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the 3rd row was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes, and we were forced to look at him at close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes not yet extinguished. Behind me I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me I heard a voice answer, "Where he is. This is where, hanging here from this gallows." That night the soup tasted of corpses.